All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We've got about, I think, 5 different videos that I'm going to show you a little bit. And we're going to talk about the fossil record. We're going to talk about dinosaur bones. You know, they're finding tissue in dinosaur bones now, and that doesn't fit the theory of evolution at all. We're going to go back and watch a video that we watched before. But we're going to start out with the fossils. And these are quotes from evolutionists. And don't ever let somebody tell you that the fossil record the theory of evolution is supported by the fossil record, because it's not at all. These guys are evolutionists, and this is what they say about the fossil record. It said, David Roop, the first one, after 120 years, the case for evolution in the fossil record is worse now than in Darwin's time. And even Darwin said the fossil record was the most obvious and serious objection to his theory. So it started out, Darwin knew he had major problems with the fossil record already. David Kitts, evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. So the fossil record does not have intermediate forms. Okay? Stephen Jay Gould, most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. Again, they're still thinking millions and billions of years here that the fossils took to lay down. Change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappeared. And then Stephen Jay Gould, he's been gone for about 25 years now. I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress in life's history the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. We have sought to impose a pattern that we hope to find on a world that does not really. And they basically, again, the world has tried to come up with their explanation. And sad to say, a lot of Christians have bought into that, because we're going out to the world and we're being educated by the world and we're listening to the world. And somehow we're trying to fit the world into what we believe of biblical. And that's the bad idea. We need to realize what their philosophy is. They're starting with an assumption there's no God. And they think they can explain everything without a God. And we need to know that. That's their assumption. That's their starting point in science. There is no creator, no designer, no purpose in life. Everything just came about by time and chance. Okay, so we're going to see this video, and I think it's a really good one. I think you'll learn a lot about the fossil record.
The fossil record is the totality of all the fossils that are found in the rock layers beneath us in the Earth's crust. The fossil record is often said to support evolution and, therefore, disprove creation. Well, a person can say that the moon is made out of green cheese, but that doesn't make it true. When we look at the actual evidence, we find that the moon isn't made of cheese, and we find that the fossil record supports creation and falsifies evolution. How so? Well, there are several specific evidences we could discuss, but let's look at what are generally agreed to be probably the 3 most broad, sweeping characteristics of the fossil record. If naturalism and evolution were true, when we look at the general characteristics of the fossil record, what would we expect to see? Well, we'd expect to see at the very bottom simple, single-celled organisms, and in the rocks above them, slightly more complex creatures that they evolved into, and above them, slightly more complex creatures, and so forth, with billions of transitional fossils that form a chain of gradually evolving species up through the rock layers, eventually leading to humans. Eventual extinction of a species would be virtually guaranteed, because species would be evolving into something better. So the previous less fit species would be pushed out and should go extinct over time. We wouldn't, however, expect simultaneous worldwide mass extinctions, because mass extinctions would mean that major catastrophes affected the Earth in the past, what we call catastrophism. But evolution is based on uniformitarianism, the belief that what we see happening today in geology has always happened in the same way throughout geologic time. Well, we don't see major catastrophes happening today that cause mass extinctions, so we wouldn't predict those to happen in the fossil record either. From a biblical creation perspective, we'd predict basically the exact opposite. At the base of the fossil record, the the pre-flood layers, you'd expect very few fossils, since the 1,600 years of time before the flood wouldn't have provided the usual conditions that are necessary to make many fossils. But starting at the flood layers, we'd expect an explosion of already fully formed creatures without any evolutionary history, both simple and complex right off the bat, a snapshot of the death that happened during the flood. The order of the fossils, from low to high in the rock layers, would probably tend to preserve the progression of the flood, not the progression of species, starting from the seafloor and moving into the oceans and then the coastlines and finally land. We'd expect the fossils of sea creatures to be found across the planet, even on continents, due to the flood. When a species' fossils appear in the fossil record, we'd expect the fossils to change very little in the rocks above them, since species don't evolve into completely new species. They just diversify into varieties of the same basic type of creature. We'd expect some species to appear in the fossil record and then disappear after the flood, since the Earth was so drastically changed that many species would no longer be well suited to the Earth's new environment. Well, when we look at the general characteristics of the fossil record, we find that creationist predictions are verified and the evolutionary predictions are falsified, effectively refuting Darwinian evolution. Famous Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould called the evolutionists' fossil record dilemma an uncomfortable paradox. And you can see why that would be the case. The first major sweeping characteristics of the fossil record that is highlighted even by evolutionists is called abrupt appearance. What they mean by abrupt appearance is that when a new species appears in the fossil record, it appears abruptly. It's fully formed without any clear evolutionary ancestors. Perhaps the most obvious example of abrupt appearance is what is called the Cambrian explosion. In the Cambrian rock layers, down at the base of the fossil record, there's an explosion of life, the immediate appearance of many totally different kinds of life. Some are simple and some aren't, and they don't have any evolutionary history. They just abruptly appear. Famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins said, "The Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Well, why would it delight creationists? Well, because it's exactly what we'd predict to be the case when the evidence from the fossil record is studied if creation is true. Characteristic number 2 of the fossil record, what they call stasis. What they mean by stasis is that when a species' fossils first appear in the fossil record, they stay basically the same throughout the rock layers above them until they finally disappear, presumably going extinct. In other words, they don't evolve. In fact, there are dozens of species which appear supposedly millions of years ago, which are still alive today but haven't changed. Their close similarity to their fossil counterparts cause people to call these species living fossils. If evolution were true, one would think that transitional fossils that show the evolutionary progression of one species into another, would be all over the earth. Because from an evolutionary perspective, life has been around on the earth for over 4 billion years, and there have been billions of species evolving over that time, so there should be billions upon billions of transitional fossils. And yet of the few fossils that have been found, which some evolutionists argue are transitional fossils, every one of them is controversial. Even the evolutionists don't agree with each other that they are transitional fossils. And to make the problem worse, when paleontologists uncover a fossil that they hope will pass as a transitional form, not only is the fossil still controversial, even among evolutionists, but the fossil ends up being from a vertebrate organism. Creatures that have a backbone. But vertebrate fossils make up only about 0.0125% of the fossil record. They're basically irrelevant in proving whether or not evolution happened. Since they fossilize more easily, invertebrates make up the bulk of the fossil record, creatures without a backbone. Since well over 99.9% of the fossil record is made up of invertebrate fossils, The invertebrates are the fossils to watch to know if evolution actually happened. But rarely, if ever, do evolutionists even claim to find invertebrate transitional forms, even though they are, to all intents and purposes, the fossil record. If species evolve in the way described by evolutionists, then number one, transitional forms should not be difficult to find. And number two, when they're found, they'd be invertebrates most of the time. Neither of those predictions hold true. Notice what Colin Patterson said years ago. At the time, he was the editor of the journal that's put out by the British Museum of Natural History in London. He wrote a book on evolution. He literally wrote the textbook on evolution, but he didn't include any examples of transitional fossils in his book, which prompted people to contact him and ask why. And he responded saying, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Even Charles Darwin saw the problem. In The Origin of Species, he said, the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And notice, this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory, him talking about evolution. Characteristic number 3, extinction. Recall that if evolution were true, we'd predict extinction to be mandatory. Species are supposed to evolve, and the more fit variation should force the less fit varieties to die out. If they don't die out, then they must not have been less fit. So why did they need to evolve in the first place? Well, again, the fossil record reveals many species that are said to show up tens and even hundreds of millions of years ago, and yet they haven't gone extinct or even changed. But more than that, 5 mass extinctions are argued to have happened over the last 450 million years, according to evolutionists, where huge percentages of the species on the planet all went extinct by some kind of unknown worldwide catastrophe. Well, if that's true, then catastrophism, not uniformitarianism, fits the geological evidence, and catastrophism is what creationists have argued as being the correct way to view the geologic column and fossil record. Evolution argues for uniformitarian geology, but fossil graveyards are found all over the world where the fossils of dozens or hundreds of animals are found piled together as though drowned and then torn into shreds by a major catastrophe involving a lot of water and a lot of power. While these features of the fossil record present problems for evolution, biblical creation and the flood explain these features with ease. Most of the fossil record was formed in the flood, and the supposed mass extinctions are simply marking the flood's destructive progression from one habitat to another. The fossil record is not a record of life over billions of years, as evolution would predict. It's a record of death in the year-long flood. The flood was so catastrophic in its effects on the earth that some species never recovered after the flood and went extinct. Is the moon made of green cheese? No, sorry. Does the fossil record support evolution? No. The 3 main sweeping characteristics of the fossil record, abrupt appearance, stasis, and extinction, falsify evolutionary predictions and verify biblical creation and the global flood documented in Genesis 6 through 9. Check out our website at apologeticspress.org for more information.
Okay, another thing about the fossil record, we find marine organisms on the tops of the highest mountains in the world. Okay, so how did they get there? Well, the worldwide flood. So much stuff was going on, and just one thing that I want to comment on. The earth was going through a massive amount of uplifting and changing, and the whole foundation of the world was being pushed up, and there's good evidence that all the high mountains, these great mountains that we see around the large mountains of the world, they came up. They were literally pushed up, probably towards the end of the record, the flood. They were pushed up, And before they were even solidified, those layers were solidified, they were pushed up. So we see the mountains pushed up through these geologic formations around, and as they were pushing up, of course, a lot of the marine fossils ended up on the tops of the mountains. Okay, here's a couple more quotes here about the fossil record. The known fossil record fails to document a single example of a phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphological change. As is now well known, most fossil species appear instantly in the fossil record, persist for millions of years, they say, and virtually unchanged and disappear roughly. Okay, and then Mark Ridley said, in any case, no real evolutionist uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Okay, we're going to see another video here. It's pretty short. And he talks about dinosaur soft tissues. And for years and years, they've been digging up fossils, digging up fossils, digging up fossils. And I don't have the exact date, but probably around 15, 20 years ago, a lady they had this major Tyrannosaurus rex bone, and they couldn't get it out, so they had to cut it in half. And the helicopters come and had to take it out. When they cut it in half, they find soft tissue. And of course, they're thinking soft tissue. Now we got to figure out how the soft tissue in a dinosaur was able to survive for millions of years. That's in their mind. Not that, well, are we right about millions of years? Which is really what they should have asked themselves, but they don't, because they can't give that up. They can't change that. I mean, they're just grounded in it. And now a lot of for the main idea, but there are a lot of scientists who, especially towards the end of their career, start coming around and realizing that, there's major problems, and a lot of them become creationists, and a lot of them become young Earth creationists as well. So they're coming around. It takes a while for some.
Imagine watching an interview on television and hearing a blind, deaf, wrinkled, hunchbacked, bedridden man claim that he was 130 years old. Although many would likely be skeptical of such a declaration of age, if ever there was a man in modern times to live 130 years on Earth, he surely would have looked as worn out as this man. Imagine, however, if a quick-witted, strong, marathon runner with fair skin, thick, dark hair, low blood pressure, high bone mineral density, and good memory alleged to be 130 years old. What reasonable individual would believe such a claim? Virtually everyone would doubt the declaration, especially the doctors who had found the man's overall health to be comparable to that of a 20-year-old, not a 130-year-old. Now take a step into the world of evolutionary science. According to evolution's assumption-based geologic timetable, since dinosaurs supposedly became extinct 65 million years ago, any dinosaur fossil found in the ground must be at least 65 million years old. But what if the fossils don't appear to be that old? What if, when inspected by scientists, various dinosaur bones around the world were discovered with highly fibrous, flexible, and resilient bone tissue that, when stretched, returns to its original shape? What if proteins such as collagen were found along with hemoglobin, elastin, and laminin, as well as cell-like structures resembling blood and bone cells? Would evolutionists come to a similar conclusion as most everyone would about a marathon-running 130-year-old? Apparently not. In the last several years, scientists have reported unearthing a variety of dinosaur bones from around the world that are not completely fossilized and which contain intact protein fragments, including ones known as collagen and elastin. Amazingly, once the minerals are stripped away from the soft tissues, the researchers have been able to squeeze round, dark red, microscopic structures from what is thought to be dinosaur blood vessels. However, since according to one evolutionary author, proteins in tissue normally degrade quickly after an animal dies, research on soft tissues remain controversial and contentious. Since evolutionists published their findings of soft tissue in 2005 and 2007 about allegedly 68 million-year-old T-Rex soft tissue, a much more thorough study has been done on a supposed 80 million-year-old fossil from a duck-billed dinosaur. What did researchers find? This time, an even larger number of protein fragments were found. After using chemicals to dissolve away the minerals, scientists have seen what appears to be a network of soft, transparent vessels, cells, and extracellular matrix. One Harvard Medical School biochemist independently confirmed the presence of collagen, as well as laminin and elastin, two proteins found in blood vessels. Any strong, marathon-running, dark-haired, fair-skinned, wrinkle-free, 20-year-old looking modern man who claims to be 130 years old would be discredited immediately. Science and common sense would demand that the 130-year date be rejected. But what about the dates evolutionists give us for these rather young-looking dinosaur bones? Bones with what one evolutionist called miraculously preserved soft tissue. Now that the once controversial and contentious dinosaur collagen has been confirmed, are leading evolutionists reconsidering the age of dinosaur fossils? Are they considering the possibility that dinosaurs may have lived hundreds or thousands of years ago rather than 60+ million years ago? Apparently not. At least not in their writings. Evolutionists are eerily silent about this blatant contradiction. How can dinosaur fossils, reportedly 80 million years old or 29,200,000,000 days old, contain collagen, hemoglobin, elastin, and laminin, as well as cell-like structures resembling blood and bone cells? The problem is not with dinosaur bones. Repeated studies over the last several years have verified the presence of soft tissue. The problem is with the assumption-based evolutionary dating methods. Dinosaur bones are not 80 million years old. To learn more about dinosaurs, creation, and evolution, visit us at apologeticspress.org.
Okay. The next video we're going to talk about, it's a pretty short video, but this is the thing where scientists think it's a fact that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And what they use is they call it radiometric dating. And I'm just going to explain a little bit, and they're going to explain a little bit more. But basically, there are some elements that are basically unstable. And they have so many protons and neutrons in the nucleus that they basically emit particles from the nucleus. They're like helium nuclei, and they change. As soon as they lose protons or gain protons, they change elements because the number of protons determine what the element is. And so they use this dating method, and it's basically radiometric dating. The one they use most of all is for uranium to change into lead. And when they observe those rocks today, they see a rate, and they can tell the rate is that way. But they have a lot of assumptions that they don't tell anybody. One assumption is they're assuming the rate of change has always been the same. Did anybody go back? Has anybody gone back, a few thousand years and checked the rocks a million years or a billion years, and they really know that those rocks, the rate of change has always been the same? They don't know that. They're just assuming that. And there's other assumptions as well. And when they actually date a rock, that they know how old it is, because the age starts as soon as it goes from a molten rock into a solid rock, all those dates that they know the date of never come out right. They're off millions and millions of years on the dating. And so that's what the basic idea of this next video is about, radiometric dating.
The Bible has God miraculously creating the world and everything in it in just 6 days about 6,000 years ago. But the theory of evolution has a much different timescale, taking millions of years to go from goo to me and you by way of the zoo. Which view is correct? Well, to be honest, both views require faith because no one was there thousands or millions of years ago to observe how it all got started. But can the idea of millions of years of evolution be scientifically validated? Can we really prove this idea of deep time using the same observational science we use for making medicine and putting people on the moon? Validation is the process of confirming what is believed to be true by what can be observed to be true. Has this ever been done for radiometric dating? The process that gives us the very idea of long ages? Actually, long ages and radiometric dating hasn't stood up to the validation test. Radiometric dating has never been validated against the absolute known ages of rocks. Let us explain. Consider Mount St. Helens, This volcano erupted in the 1980s, giving scientists the opportunity to date the rocks that were formed from the eruption. The results? 5 different ages, all between 350,000 and 2.8 million years old, for rocks that we know were less than 30 years old. This discrepancy happens all the time in radiometric dating studies. In fact, there has never been a radiometric dating analysis that simply produces ages that validate to the known ages of rocks. And if radiometric dating doesn't work for rocks of known ages, why do we trust it for rocks of unknown ages? So the next time you hear millions of years ago this happened or that, just ask, how do you know that for sure? And if radiometric dating is the answer given, just ask, are you aware of a study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock? And you'll find the answer will undoubtedly be no. God wrote with his own hand that he created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in just 6 ordinary days. The genealogies in Genesis lead us straight back to Adam, just about 6,000 years ago. Have you ever noticed how hard the world pushes the idea of millions of years? Books, movies, museums, schools, it's everywhere. But does any of this even matter? Well, consider this. Many people will only consider the Bible's message if they believe the Bible to be credible, both historically and scientifically. Each person's eternity, either in heaven or hell, depends on what they believe about the risen Christ. And how do we know about this? Well, it's in the Bible. And if people don't believe the Bible got it right on the first page, who's going to trust the rest? So, because it takes faith to believe in either the Bible or the world's view of this distant past, is it a better choice to trust God or fallible man? Download the Genesis Apologetics mobile app here for more videos on this topic and others.
There are actually about 100 different ways to date the earth. And there are some dates that give us around thousands of years, and there's some dates millions of years, and some dates hundreds of millions, and some dates billions of years. So there's many, many, many different ways to date the earth. But the scientists, since no one has ever seen real evolution occur, where we have new information, new gene systems that we can actually look at and say, oh, look at it appearing. We can see it happening right before us. That's never been observed. So if they can convince us that the earth is billions of years old, we think, well, billions of years old. I mean, anything can happen in billions of years. That's the way we think, but that's really not true. And so there are lots of ways to date the earth. Probably the best way to date something is to date the youngest ages, go with the youngest ages and not the oldest ages, because that would give us really a better reality of how old something is. Okay, we're going to see, this is a video, Dr. Robert Carter. He's really good. Now, let me say something, and, we could have done this thing real simple. We could have got, hopefully, a whole bunch of people, and we could have just told them a little bit, and we could have handed it out. There's so much information online, and this is why we gave it. So if you didn't get one of these, you need to get one of these. There's some really good stuff out there, really good videos, and I would much rather show a video than talk, because obviously you'd rather see some good graphics and all that just to listen to me talk. But there's some really good, so if you read this over, and there's some creation sites here, so if you have a question, you can go on these sites and ask these sites, because Answers in Genesis and ICR and CMI, they've studied this, and they have a lot of good answers to your questions. So if you have questions, did anybody not get one of these? We still have some of these left, so be sure and get one before you leave if you didn't get one. Okay, we're going to watch this video. Now, what this is this Robert Carter they've been checking DNA of humans around the world now, okay? And they've got a pretty good idea of mutations and how long mutations are building up inside the genome. And they're able to trace it back, and it's amazing. It's amazing. Now, Robert Carter didn't actually do the investigation, but you, as a scientist, you can always go into the research and look at it, and that's how most scientists do their work anyway. They don't actually do the work, but they just read what the other scientists have found out. They might do some experiments on their own, but he did some research, and basically he's found out that what we're seeing in the human genome today fits exactly what the Bible says, and this is awesome.
Rob, when we talk about DNA, I think most people are probably thinking about all of the human DNA now that comes up. And what are we learning about the DNA of the human being?
You know, since we started DNA analysis, basically most everything we've learned has contradicted the standard model, the standard out of Africa idea. The idea that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, the idea that Neanderthals are not human. There's all these things that have come up that are completely contrary to what anyone expected.
And how do we then refute that old story of out of Africa?
In a lot of different ways. First of all, we've got DNA sequences now from thousands of people from all over the world. And there's just some things that are very clear. And the first big surprise was how similar people are from one end of the world to the other. That was not what people expected. I mean, back in Charles Darwin's day, he was trying to split people up into races and almost into species. Other people claim they were different species. Darwin never quite went that far. But the evolutionists were trying to divide people up into tribes and clades and groups. But what we found out through gene sequencing is that people are nearly identical from one end of the world to the other.
Well, what does that commonality of genetic code across people all over the earth, what does that tell us? What do we learn from that?
Oh, it tells us tons of things. First of all, it tells us that we all came from a single small population just a short time ago. It tells us that there's only been one dispersal of people across the planet. It tells us that the center of diversity of all people in the world is somewhere between Northeast Africa and the Middle East. So the origin of mankind is pretty much where the Bible says it was. The origin of mankind involves a small people group, just like the Bible says. The origin of mankind involves a dispersal across the world. Everything we're learning is pointing more and more toward a biblical answer for the origin of humanity.
How do we come to the conclusion that the human race has not been around that long?
Well, one thing we can do is we can look at the mutation rate that we can measure in the laboratory. We can take a bunch of people that we know are closely related, we can look at their DNA, we can count up the number of differences between them. Then we can say, okay, that's the rate. Now let's look at all the people around the world. How long would it take to explain all these people given the rate that we know? And the answer is a few thousand years. For both the man's lineages, which is the Y chromosome, and the female lineages, which is the mitochondrial DNA, both of them give us a similar answer that people are not millions of years old.
Tell me more about the different chromosomes that come as a result of being male or female. How does that help us understand this?
Because there are two specific small pieces of DNA that are passed down the generations unchanged, most chromosomes, they recombine, and so the genes get scrambled. But the Y chromosome is only inherited from father to son to grandson to great-grandson. And so if a mutation occurs, it stays only in that lineage. There's this other little piece of DNA called the mitochondrial DNA that, from a lot of experiments, it's only passed on from the mother to the child. So my children did not inherit my mitochondrial DNA, they inherited my wife's mitochondrial DNA. Because of that, it's also passed like the Y chromosome from one generation to the next unchanged. Except if a mutation occurs, you have a new lineage. And so when we look at the Y chromosomes around the world, it is abundantly clear that they're all very, very similar to one another. And if we count up the number of differences between them, it's 500 or 600 differences. Maybe as many as 800 at the most can explain all the men in the world.
Oh.
Wait a minute. At a mutation rate that we know, we'd expect a couple of mutations per generation. That's only a few hundred generations. That's biblical time frame right there. For the mitochondrial DNA, most people in the world are about 20 to 25 mutations separated from the mitochondrial ancestor, Eve. Well, that's just a few hundred generations.
So what we're seeing here, there is a stark difference between a Genesis paradigm approach to how man began and how long he's been around, as opposed to the conventional paradigm that says man has been around for millions of years and in various stages. And what you're saying is the genetics don't seem to support that.
The genetics, if we use real-world mutation rates measured in the laboratory, the genetics indicates that man is very recent. But there's another factor we also have to account for, and that is what happens to mutations over time in a population. See, every child that's born has more mutations than the parent was born with. That means that every generation is actually a step down from the ancestors. And at the rate we can measure, it's, 60 to 100 mutations per generation is a nice average. At that rate, we will go extinct before millions of years happens.
So there are really two ways to look at this issue. One is how fast the mutations are changing, and because of that, we can't have been around that long.
That's right.
But if we have been around that long, that mutation rate would have
killed us.
We'd be dead.
We would be extinct. The standard model, the evolutionary model, requires that mutations are removed over time. But there's not enough time. There's too many mutations, and it overwhelms them mathematically. Back in the 1950s, this famous scientist named Haldane, he said that if there's as many as one mutation per every 10 children, we're guaranteed to go extinct. Well, it's about 100 per child. That's 1,000 times worse than the worst case scenario they can handle mathematically.
And what you're saying then is that this evidence really is pointing back again to the biblical historical record.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we look at just people all around the world, they're so similar to each other. It's clear we came from actually an atom. So little me, like I used to have a red beard, right? It's all white now, but this red is a mutation. It's a broken gene. I don't have brown hair anymore, or the skin color that one of my ancestors picked up. This is a broken gene. We even know where gene is. We know what letter change happened in that gene. And all Europeans share that skin color. It's a broken gene. So we need a little bit of genetic diversity, 6,000 years of mutation, and we can explain people with no common ancestry to chimpanzees. We don't need millions of years. We don't need evolution.
Concerning the chimpanzee, the conventional paradigm tells us over and over again that we have like 98% similar genetic code with the chimpanzee. Is that true?
It is absolutely not true that we're 98% identical to chimpanzees. Some of my colleagues have run the numbers, and when you just take a piece of the chimpanzee genome and look at the human genome, you get about 80% identity. And when you do the reverse, you get about 80% identity. This 98% was a myth. When they sequenced the chimpanzee genome, they didn't want to spend $3 billion on it. That's how much it took to do the first human genome. In order to sequence a genome back then, what they would do is they would randomly sequence lots and lots of little pieces, about 300 base pairs long. And then they would line them up. They used a big computer program to line them up. And if you had enough pieces, you'd fill all the holes. And you have to sequence it about 30-fold over. And then you have enough to make sure you don't have a gap. When they did the chimpanzee genome, they sequenced it 5 times over and lined it up on the human genome. So they assumed common ancestry without ever testing it, and they made a Swiss cheese genome. There are so many holes in the chimpanzee genome, it's not usable. So several years later, someone went back and they only resequenced just the Y chromosome. And it turned out to be radically different. The Y chromosome in chimpanzee is half the size of the Y chromosome in human. And of the half that they share with us, it's only 70% similar to the human version. The paper that did it, they said that was as much difference as we expected between man and something like a chicken.
Well, for sure, what we know is that the human being is radically different than any of the other animals that we see around us. In fact, it's only the human being that can create that scuba gear that I was wearing to keep me alive underneath the water.
That the humankind is the only species that God created that has the capacity to wonder and marvel about the world that God created.
Well, I want to learn more about them. But in the remaining time, maybe we can do some more underwater stuff, huh?
The weather's really nice. Let's go on another dive.
Let's do it. So, what would I be doing on my next dive?
The next dive will be the same as the first dive.
Scientists are finding
Maybe
out so
stop
many
and have a little
things.
time to stare at something.
Yeah.
would have to be a guided dive.
about the similarities between different people. And it's not coming out like they thought, because remember, originally they thought we evolved, so you're going to have these. Darwin himself said basically that the Caucasian, that the black man is halfway between a Caucasian and orangutan. That's what Darwin thought. Now, does anybody ever hear stuff like that about Darwin? No, they're not going to hear it, sometime, but they're not going to go back, and the news media is not going to go back. I mean, they should, because that's about as most radical, racist thing that anybody's ever said in the world, what Darwin said. Okay? Now, here's what they're finding out, but nobody's hearing about it. They have literally found out that the percent difference between the average, I'm talking about average now, so you got to think of average, that's a pretty good span there. The average black man and the average white man genetically is 0.012% different. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you? Why don't they tell people that? That would end a lot of racism right there. Because really, genetically, the black people are not, we're all the same. We're all the same. It's dumb for people to think there's races, because really there's no races anymore. There's just one race, and that's the human race, and that's what the Bible tells us. So that should be our thinking. All right, we're going to watch the last part of this video that we started first or second Monday, and it's the one about question of origins.
The origin of the very first animal life out of ordinary complex chemicals is so large that no evolutionist has ever been able to overcome it, and it is one of the biggest barriers to the theory of evolution that I know.
Even if proteins miraculously formed, we still are not close to producing life. The simplest living cells require thousands of specialized proteins in order to function.
A number of scientists have tried to calculate the probability of life arising by chance. Sir Fred Hoyle, a British mathematician, using a supercomputer and the assistance of graduate students, estimated only the origin of the proteins of an amoeba, 2,000 of them, arising by chance. He estimated that the probability that the proteins of an amoeba could arise by chance is 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power.
A probability of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power is absurdly small. To illustrate this, consider the probability of snatching a particular atom out of the entire universe is 1 chance in 10 to the 80th power. After making this calculation, British mathematician Sir Frederick Hoyle stated, "The likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence."
We can prove mathematically that evolution is just a joke. It couldn't possibly happen. Richard Dawkins, for example, one of the leading evolutionists, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he acknowledges that the nucleus of every cell, plant, animal, or human, has a database larger than the 30-volume set of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
All life, plants, animals, and man, are made up of cells. Each cell is a miniaturized city performing the complex functions required for life to exist. The cell membrane is self-repairing and consists of special proteins that monitor what is outside of the cell, as well as select which molecules are allowed to enter. These proteins act as pumping stations, controlling the import of nutrients and the export of waste materials.
Just a minute, not yet.
Inside the cell, we find staggering complexity. For example, the endoplasmic reticulum is a transportation network with protein-producing factories called ribosomes. The ribosomes produce many types of specific proteins, while the ER channels them to precise locations. The Golgi bodies transport proteins to the exterior membrane, while lysosomes act as digestive organs that break down and recycle larger molecules into particles the cell can use. The mitochondria are the power plants of the cell, producing the fuel that the cell consumes. The nucleus contains the data center, which governs cell activity. Inside the nucleus, we find the chromosomes, which contain the DNA molecule that functions as a library and contains all the coded information needed for life. Billions of instructions are coded on this error-detecting and error-correcting self-replicating molecule. Only if all of these structures were created simultaneously could a cell function. For example, to produce DNA, a cell requires more than 75 different types of proteins. Yet these proteins are only produced at the direction of DNA. The only solution to this dilemma is creation.
The odds of getting DNA making protein on a roll of the molecular dice is like the odds of getting a 13 on a pair of gaming dice. The potential is not there. The probability is just plain zero.
Evolution teaches that bacteria were one of the first life forms to evolve from chemicals. Many bacteria propel themselves with a type of miniature motor called a flagellum. These extremely efficient reversible motors rotate up to 100,000 revolutions per minute. The bacterial motor is similar to an electric motor. It has a filament that acts as a propeller, a universal joint, a stator and a rotor, and a drive shaft with bushings. Each part of the motor must function, or the bacteria will die. Since bacteria can start, stop, and change direction and speeds, they must have sophisticated sensors, switches, and control mechanisms. All of this is highly miniaturized. 8 million of these motors would fit in the cross-sectional area of a human hair. While bacteria are small, they are not simple.
You know, I think probably the weakest link in all of evolution theory is the idea of the origin of life from non-living chemicals. It's probably easier to get from a cell to a person than it is to get from chemicals to life. The gap there is just so incredibly large. I'm convinced that life is so complicated, so complex, so intricately engineered that wherever life exists, God created it. It could not have come by natural processes. Life comes from a creator, and that creator tells us that he created life here on earth. Here we see it, unimaginably complex. It must have been created.
I believe humans evolved to where we are today from single-celled organisms based on the theory of Darwinism and natural selection. I don't think that there was any sort of divine intervention.
I believe evolution is pretty much a proven theory.
I don't believe in a higher order, just because the fact that I haven't seen any, proof or, concrete evidence of that, and until somebody shows me, that there is, then I'm going to have an aversion to organized religion, and I'm going to stay on the basis of chemical evolution.
No life is simple, and all life shows the handiwork of a designer. Scientists know this, yet many believe in chemical evolution rather than be accountable to the Creator God of the Bible. Next, we will examine the evolutionary view that simple life has evolved into complex life.
Okay, Cynthia, I just want to make a note here about chemical evolution. This is quite a story. There's a guy named Dr. Dean Kenyon, and this guy was a chemical evolutionist, and he wrote a book that was used at the universities for years to basically teach students how it happened, how chemicals somehow came together and formed the first life. And he wrote this book, and it was used for 20 years in the universities. 20 years, there was a class, they taught chemical evolution over and over and over again. About 5 years after he wrote this book, he was questioned by his students about some things about how could this be and how could that be and all that. And he began to think, and he began to check, and he began to look, and he tried to answer their questions, and he couldn't. And before long, after a few years, he eventually realized that it couldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. There had to be a creator, there had to be a God, and he became a creationist. But my point here is that here's this book. How many books do we have at our universities, that have these stories about what happened long, long ago and far, far away, and how the earth came into existence, and all that kind of stuff, that basically are not verifiable. They're just a bunch of theories trying to explain how everything came about without a God. And it was pretty incredible that Dean Kenyon realized, this, and he changed. But even after he realized it, they still used his book in the universities. How many books out there in the universities are being used to teach a bunch of stuff because of the atheistic humanistic philosophy that demands that they teach that? They don't have any choice because that's the philosophy of science. There is no God. Everything came about by time and chance. Okay, Cynthia.
Assuming that life miraculously appeared on Earth, is it possible that single-cell life evolved to become all the complex plants and animals we see today?
That was Darwin's idea that everything, every living thing on the Earth eventually could be traced back to a common ancestor.
The thing that Darwinists believe is that all the species on Earth have evolved by a process of spontaneous genetic mutation, that's a spontaneous change in the DNA, which is the program for every living thing, coupled with natural selection, the survival of the fittest. The extraordinary thing is that although the theory has been pretty well accepted universally for over a century now, there is absolutely no direct evidence to support it at all.
Darwin made a big deal about the fact that there were various sizes of finches, small, large, medium-sized finches. He made a big deal of the fact that there were finches with large beaks, thick beaks, long beaks, and thin beaks. Darwin assumed that these beaks were evidence of evolution. In fact, these beaks were the result of the genetic variability that already existed in the population. If you take two medium finches with medium-sized beaks and you breed them, you will get some finches with small beaks and some finches with larger beaks. Over time, as these finches spread out into the various environments, certain beak sizes would be favored in certain environments, and therefore they would become the predominant type. But the point is the capability to produce the small beaks, the medium beaks, and the large beaks was already in the parent population of the Galapagos finches, and it was simply the environmental differences that allowed them to be expressed. It was not the creation of any new and unique information.
The trouble is that all these finches actually do interbreed, and that is in biology, this is the test of a species. Two creatures which can breed and produce live fertile young are regarded as belonging to the same species, and all the Galapagos finches meet that criterion, so there are not many species.
If evolution was true, we wouldn't be concerned about the extinction of species. There'd be new ones being created. We don't have new species. We got deterioration. We have all kinds of species that no longer exist.
Charles Darwin theorized that given enough time, one kind of animal could evolve into another. This is the basis for the evolutionary tree of life taught in biology. Yet Darwin himself acknowledged the lack of transitional fossils in the rock strata. Darwin wrote, "Intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory."
The key problem with Darwinism is finding hard physical evidence. Where would you look for that evidence? Well, obviously in the rocks, in the record of the rocks, the fossil record. Fossils have been collected for hundreds of years, for centuries. There are billions of fossils in every university and every museum in the world. But there are no intermediate species. You look at one strata and you find one kind of fossil. You look at the strata above it, you find a different kind of fossil. What you don't find is a gradual change.
One of the greatest evidences for creation is found in the fossil record. For example, in the so-called Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of a vast array of very complex invertebrates: clams, snails, jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, trilobites. and many other very complex invertebrates. But nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found fossilized ancestors to a single one of those complex invertebrates. Now that fact alone demolishes the theory of evolution.
Evolutionists claim that these invertebrates in turn evolved into vertebrates, such as fish. However, over the last 150 years, scientists have unearthed billions of invertebrate and vertebrate fossils, and they have not found a single transitional form.
Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed, no trace of ancestors, and certainly no trace of transitional form linking these major kind of fishes to one another. Now that fact is known. Evolutionists know that. Now the fact that we have no ancestors for the fishes, the vertebrates, we have no ancestors for the invertebrates, means that we didn't have any ancestors, and evolution is impossible.
A study of the geological record confirms that the major groups of animals each appear abruptly and fully formed. For example, within the insect world, there is enormous variety and complexity. Yet evolutionists offer no conclusive evidence that any of the insects evolved from a common ancestor. The same problem exists for all of the great variety of amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. The evolutionary tree of life has no trunk nor branches. Therefore, all of the implied intermediates are only blind speculation.
Sometimes Darwinists hold up examples of what they say are transitions. For example, I suppose the best known example is Archaeopteryx, which appears to be half dinosaur, half bird. The trouble is, when you look at the dinosaurs that it might have evolved from, what you find is that none of those dinosaurs had a collarbone, and birds all do have a keeled breastbone which holds the pectoral muscles, which enables it to flap its wings.
It has been claimed in the past that Archaeopteryx was really nothing more than a feathered reptile. Well, I've never seen a reptile yet that you just stick a bunch of feathers in and kick it in the tail and it flies. And no, Archaeopteryx flew. He had wings, and he certainly wasn't a feathered reptile. As a matter of fact, I have an article here before me, published in March 1996 in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology. And the authors say this: the avian features of the skull demonstrate that Archaeopteryx is a bird rather than a feathered non-avian archosaur.
The most important missing link of all, of course, is the missing link between an ape-like ancestor and mankind. That's the missing link that most of us are interested in. Have we found that? Well, if you listen to Darwinists, you'd think that we found lots of them. In fact, the evidence really isn't there at all. All of the fossils that have been found so far have been classified, reclassified, either as human or as ape. And so far, the missing link is still missing.
I have been investigating the so-called missing link between man and ape for many years, and I have found that every single one of them simply is no link whatsoever. For example, Australopithecus, the skeleton of Lucy, this really consists only of a 40% skeleton of a not very large ape, and they have not got any evidence that it ever walked upright in any of the bones that they have found of that skeleton.
The interesting thing about that is that Lucy is shown as being distinctly human-like. She's very erect in her posture, she's got human-like hands, human-like feet. I'm not quite sure where exactly the restorers got this data from, because if you examine the paper by Randall and Sussman, which described the type species to which Lucy belongs, they said quite clearly that she had long, curved hands and feet, even longer and even more curved than a chimpanzee. Several distinguished anatomists have reached the conclusion that, for example, Australopithecus, the genus to which Lucy belongs, was simply an extinct ape, nothing at all to do with humans.
If we analyze the so-called missing links, we find a trail of fraud, deception, and speculation. For example, Nebraska Man was reconstructed, family and...
Well, hopefully, maybe next week we'll get into what he just said about the human evolution. It's been estimated that if you took all the bones, so-called bones, that they would classify as hominids or some kind of creature that we evolved from, would probably fit in a box this big. I mean, the evidence is just not there. And there's lots of fraud and deception and stuff that's gone on over the years it was in the textbooks for years, and then they finally came back and said, they didn't really say it. They don't even tell anybody when they find out something was wrong. But anyway, we'll talk about that. All right, thanks for all coming out, and God bless you all.